article. Okay, so now it's being recorded.
Yeah, sorry.
So doing some careful evaluation helps you to understand, what a good article should look like. But also shooting holes in an article can give you inspiration as to what you can study and how you can study that to develop, better research questions or better conceptual models. I think we can go to the aim, Alex. Yeah, so the aim is to systematically evaluate the quality of that empirical research article on social media at work. So we basically want you to select within your group your own empirical research article, and that is the first step, obviously. And when you do so, we want you to keep those requirements on the sheet in mind. So first of all, with regards to the topic, it obviously has to be about social media, and then obviously also it has to be about at work. So it has to be about organizations and the communication within organizations. And we need an empirical research article. So that means that the article has to present some kind of research data in the form of a survey or an experiment. It could be qualitative research, it could be a case study, it could be content analysis, diary study, it could be a lot of methods, but it needs to present some empirical work. So rather than, for example, a conceptual article. And then also to make it maybe easier, we selected a list of journals that publish a lot about social media at work. So you can see it there. It's also in the assignment description that you can find on Canvas. But honestly, if you have a good article in some different journals, please propose that, and then we will look at it. And there's a huge chance that that might also work. But if you want to start with a hand search, then actually these journals are useful. If we go to the next sheet, I do want to stress that this is actually also an opportunity in which we have sort of a lot of freedom to also choose a topic of your liking, right? So we selected a lot of topics that we need to discuss, but this is where you can also discuss a topic that you think is important and valuable and fun within your group, obviously. Right, so actually the first things we want you to do is start looking for that article in the journals. So browse those journals, just go through maybe current editions to figure out what they wrote about social media at work. You can also search more targeted and search with some keywords that you find useful, and then check whether or not those articles are suitable. And actually, this week or by Tuesday, September 8th, we want each group to upload a PDF of the article on Canvas. So we have the first assignment is actually upload a PDF. That should be easy. And then just to make sure that you already have a plan in case that article cannot work for some reason, please mention a backup article in the comments. And so indeed it is a group assignment. So discuss among your group how you're going to do that. So each group member could propose an article, and then you can decide between each other which one is most suitable. Should only one group member can upload the article. That suffices. Actually, if one of the members uploads it shows as the article for the whole group. And so it's not necessary that you choose an article that is particularly good or particularly bad. So usually there's some goods and some bads. But really just pick an article that fascinates all group members. yeah, we have one research master student who does it by him or herself. Okay, so that is the first step. So by Tuesday, we want you to upload that research article, and then by Thursday we will discuss that in a small group meeting. So if you have your article, now what? What are you going to do? So what we have done, we have developed some sort of methodology to systematically evaluate the quality of that research article. And then, you know, there's just a couple of elements that we need in the assignment. That so don't be too creative with regards to structure, but you can just keep this structure, which basically means you evaluate sort of each important part of the article. And that obviously starts with the research question that is introduced in the introduction, and then the conceptual model that is usually introduced in the theoretical framework, then a study design and a method. We don't want you to reflect too much on or at all on the results and analysis, because this is not a methodology course. And therefore, the next one is the discussion and conclusion. Yes, a group can also consist of 3 group members. So we ask you to sign up, you know, with 5 group members, but obviously that is not always going to work naturally. But 3 group members, we don't want 2 group members, and we proposed some groups to merge. Therefore, but 4 or 5 works, and 3 should also work. Do you have to keep the used variables? I'm not sure if I understand that question. You comment on the variables that they have used?
I think it is as if you have to provide an alternative, if you can develop a new or add to the conceptual model.
Right. Oh, let me get to that in a little bit. Yeah. Okay. I'll get there in a little bit. Yeah. So first you start with the introduction, right? So reflect on the strength of that introduction, and in introduction, the main aim is always to introduce and to explain the urgency of a research question. And usually, at least a good introduction does that in 4 steps. And I'm always, you know, when I read an article, I try to identify those steps because, you know, it's really easy to see what the importance of a study is in that case. So every good introduction starts with some development or some problem that organizations are having, or that people are having, that academics are having, and that should give the paper urgency. If people don't care about that problem, or if they don't care about that development, an article is not important. And that's actually the problem with quite some articles. So starting with that problem, there is always something that we do not understand about that problem. And that is the second element, that is a knowledge gap. And that is usually a sentence, you probably recognize it, although we know a lot about this and this and this, no research has been done on la 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 la. And, you know, that knowledge gap, the authors are then aiming to close that knowledge gap through their empirical work, right? And that needs to be made explicit. Otherwise, you don't really know what knowledge an article is supposed to generate. Some articles don't do that, but you often see that sentence. And next, they need to explain why it is important to fill this knowledge gap, right? So what is the problem of us not understanding that element of the problem? If that is lacking, the paper lacks urgency. And actually, you probably, I certainly recognize that sometimes I'm reading an introduction and I'm thinking, okay, so why are they doing all this work? And that is because they don't explain the importance of that knowledge, of that that research question sufficiently. And then finally, sort of the conclusion of the introduction is then a research question that is often not formulated as a research question. It's often an aim or a task you also see. But that explains what you're going to do in the empirical research. So that may be a little bit vague, so I made it more concrete by applying this to the Treem and Leonardi article that you read for today. And there you see, I just highlighted the sentences that do exactly those four things. So the problem is right in the first paragraph, and they say social media adoption within organizations is occurring at a rapid pace. I mean, that is not a problem per se, or it could be a problem, but it's a development that they are observing, and that that is start point of this article. And then they present a pretty explicit knowledge gap. They said, despite the increased adoption, the implications of these new technologies are not well understood, right? So, and then still you could think, okay, why does that matter so much? At some other point in the article, and actually before they introduce the knowledge gap, they say social media will change your business. And that is, I would say that is not the strongest explanation of its importance, but that is supposed to explain why you should care about the implications of new technologies for organizational processes, right? And then the research question is actually formulated as 3 tasks. So that is quite ambitious. There's the first, second, and then the third is to draw the implications for organizational processes. So, you know, this is a nice example. So all 4 of the elements are present, but you also see how well they align, right? So the research question is actually exactly what the knowledge gap is, right? And then, you know, so when you reflect on the introduction, don't just look up those 4 elements, but also look at their relationships between each other. So is that knowledge gap really, does it really apply to the problem that they're introducing? And is the importance sufficiently explained? And actually there's often a misalignment. So sometimes they come up with a research question that does not really address the problem at hand. So those are really the types of questions that we want you to ask in the first part of the paper. Right, so criticize that research question, each of those 4 elements, and don't just do that. So for example, if you want to reflect on the urgency of that problem that they started, you can look up some data, right? So was the adoption of social media in 2012 rapid everywhere in all organizations? Actually, I would question that, because also right now, I mean, has social media changed, I don't know, how supermarkets work, or how a construction agency work, or how the agricultural sector work? Maybe not. And so one of the sort of tricks that authors employ is that they sort of exaggerate their problem a little bit. So you can comment on that a little bit. Same goes for the knowledge gap. Sometimes they present a knowledge gap that is not really a gap. Sometimes there is literature that already addresses that knowledge gap, and then it would be good to look that up, right? So really do this in a thorough way. Also, you know, it's a group assignment. You have a lot of thinking power there, and so don't just reflect on it, but also look up some sources to back up your analysis. And so do you buy the argument of why this is important, or can you counter argue? So you can also be a little bit of a devil's advocate here. So even if you agree, try to come up with counter arguments. And then is there an unambiguous and clearly delineated research question, right? So after doing that, after sort of criticizing what is there, we want you to propose an alternative there as well. So taking the same problem that the authors have introduced, can you come up with an alternative research question that will also generate insight into the topic at hand? And so whenever there's some problem or some development, there's a lot of angles you can have on it. And the authors only present one of them. So can you introduce another one? And then also explain why that is important. So to help you a little bit with that, research questions usually do one of three things. So they either describe a phenomenon in detail, they explain it, so they explain why or which factors contribute or what motivates people to do certain things. Or thirdly, they may explain the consequences. So what do social media do with people, for example, with organizational processes? And there's, this is also a way we want you to be creative. And I know a quite old article by Macquarie that has great tips for coming up with creative research questions. And one of the ways in which you can do, for example, if your article proposes some relationship, right? You can also ask the question, so in which circumstances does that relationship not occur? So when is the relationship between A and B or X and Y maybe different, right? Another tip is to look at your own experiences. And fortunately, so I suspect a lot of you are social media users, and also a lot of you have quite some experience in organization, either in a working role, but you're also a student in a large organization. So how would you respond to this phenomenon? Or so staying close to home may also give you inspiration as to which concepts may also be, or which processes may also be valid. And the last one I thought was really interesting as well is juxtapositioning it with opposite problems. So if they're introducing, so for example, there's too much cyberload, right? So people are being distracted too much by online tools. So would it be a problem? Could there also be a problem if people don't distract themselves with anything and only absorb, only work 24/7? That is probably also a problem. And so rather than looking at general trends, you can also look at outliers. And so also look at, for example, extreme cases, so social media addiction or social media hate, for example. So you don't have to look at general trends always. You can also look at exceptions or exceptional case studies. So for example, crisis situations or so. And that can also teach you a lot about how social media work at work. Okay, so let's move to the third component. So then we're moving to the theoretical framework. And then usually, particularly in confirmatory research, the theoretical framework proposes a conceptual model. Now that is often drawn with boxes and arrows, but sometimes in the text they propose relationships. So how well do they do so, right? So are those relationships supported by theory? Or are they sort of loosely argumented, by logical reasoning themselves? So do you think that is credible and logical, and can you challenge their arguments? So, for example, you may reflect on, sometimes they use theories from other fields, and sometimes those theories, if you take a closer look, are not really applicable, right? So check that. Or is it easy to follow and logically made, or can you counter argue again? And don't just stick to the article, but maybe also look look up the sources that they are using to underpin the model and the hypothesis. Because actually scientists are also usually pretty sloppy in making references. Sometimes some article gets misinterpreted, and then other people are copying that again and again. So really look up those original sources to really find that and unveil that. Because those errors are really made. And then again, after you criticize it, we want you to come up with an alternative. So just like for the research question, we want you to come up with an alternative to the conceptual model. So that means you might add new variables and take out others. That is fine. It may also mean that you flip them around a little bit. Maybe you can propose direct relationships where they propose a moderated relationship or a mediated relationship, and then support your alternative model also with literature, right? And argue for and make a case for the value of your model in explaining the phenomenon at hand. And again, the Maguire article, actually, I didn't post it yet, but I'll post it on Canvas. You don't have to read it completely, but I think it's if you want to sort of have some tips and guidelines as to how to think creatively about research, that is great article. So one of the ways in which you can come up with an alternative model is by changing sort of obvious causal relationship. By, for example, proposing or thinking whether a negative relationship could not be positive as well. And so, for example, if you think that people use social media because it makes them productive, are there not also circumstances in which people refrain from using social media exactly because it would boost their productivity? Now that sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but people don't always want to be productive. They don't always want to stand out between their colleagues, for example, because it would set a norm, right? So sometimes there are norms in the group for lowering productivity. So actually, Alexander talked about the value of having a large social network, but can a large social network also hurt your career? And so that sort of brings up questions about whether it's the size of a network or the strength of a network, or whether you have a lot of variety in your network. So asking these kinds of questions can bring you to new questions and new models. One other simple trick of coming up with a new model is thinking whether or not you can change the direction of a causal relationship. Could a cause not be one of the motivators or one of the factors? So for example, if you think that social media use can improve your network, you could also propose that it's actually people with a really good, with a large social network that are going to use social media more because they have difficulties managing those networks. They need LinkedIn, for example, right? So you could propose large network is a consequence of social media use, but it could also be a reason for using social media, right? So another tip is changing the causal direction of a relationship. And then you can think about extremes. So the example that Maguire is giving is eye contact increases liking, which is actually a great tip for job interviews and so. So making eye contact is a tip for getting people to like you, or dating actually, which Alex knows more about, well, from his work, right? I suppose.
Also in practice.
Okay. Let's get there in some other meeting. And then, but what if you take that to the extreme? What if you make extreme eye contact? that is obviously not going to be good for liking, right? That's going to make people extremely uncomfortable. And then it's really interesting, just as a thought exercise, to try to do that. Take a relationship to the extreme and then see when it doesn't work anymore. Okay, so after doing that, after coming up with an alternative conceptual model, we're moving on to the methodology. So we want to reflect on, okay, so is the study they developed an appropriate one for the research question? So think of the alignment between study design and research question, but then also, reflect on any of the characteristics of that methodology. So is the sample large enough, but also are there the right people? And then are the measures appropriate and validated, or are there stronger measurement skills, for example, that have been overlooked? That happens a lot. Outdated measures are often still used. So you could look that up. And is the procedure realistic? And then, yeah, so this chat about Alex's dating history is going to distract me. And again, for this section, use methodology, methodological literature, right, to back up your decision. So maybe books you've used in your methodology classes or whatever. Okay, the final element of the paper is obviously the conclusion and discussion. And then, there's a lot of errors that are being made there, or a lot of things you can comment on. It doesn't have to be errors. It can also be, a different approach to the findings. And actually, sometimes there's misalignment between what the paper has actually found and the conclusions that they're drawing. Actually, I was reviewing a paper this morning, and then I found that. So they gave some discussions that I think they were really enthusiastic about, even before they started the study, because the findings never backed up that conclusion, because the study design was not appropriate for that, for example. So another thing that discussion should always do is explain why the authors think they found what they found. Yeah, so reflect on whether or not they did that, and whether or not they did that in a credible and theory-based way. And maybe you have some alternative explanations that they didn't rule out, or that maybe there's some other theories, some other processes that may explain what the authors found. And then there's practical recommendations. So are they making, concrete practical recommendations, or are they, usually academics are not very good practical thinkers. So a lot of authors are struggling with this. So can you come up with other applications that they never thought about? And the same goes for theoretical implications. So maybe this also brings some insights into other theories that the authors didn't reflect on. And so, as you may notice, sort of in all the elements, we want you to be really thorough, right? And really go beyond what you would usually do, and then use theory and literature to do that. If you do that, you start to understand an article at sort of a very different level that also helps you to write a research article later on. Yeah. So finally, we want you to make an overall evaluation, sort of a holistic view as to, considering all those elements, what is the main contribution of the article, and what is core strength and weaknesses. So really try to estimate what is most important. It doesn't have to be balanced, right? So if you're very negative about an article, if it's bad, it's bad. If it's really good, it's really good. You can make that argument. And then we want you to sort of imagine being the peer reviewer of this paper. So this has already been published. So we already know some editor has decided that it's worthwhile to publish in the journal. But if you were, well, maybe let me explain a little bit about how articles are being published. Some of you may already understand this, but so usually academics write an article and then send it to a journal, and then an editor, if he thinks it's a topic that could work, sends it to maybe 3 or sometimes more or less reviewers, which is peers, which is other researchers in the area, and then ask them, okay, so what, basically asking a lot of the questions that we are asking you today, and then draw a conclusion whether or not this is suitable for publication. And then usually there's 4 choices to choose. First, you can accept it. If it's a really good article, you can recommend, okay, so accept it as it is. And then a really bad article is going to be a rejection, right? So the point then is, even if you rework it, if you rewrite it, it's not going to be good enough for publication ever. So don't bother. But then in between, there's obviously 2 other options. That is minor revisions. So in that case, you recommend you have to change some things, but it's not very drastically. But then explain which things the authors would have to change. And major revisions basically means that you recommend the authors to sort of almost start over again. Use the same data, but write a different paper about it, and really change really substantial things about it. Yeah, the papers are already published, but we're going to imagine that they aren't. So indeed, already reviewers have commented on these articles, and the editor has already decided. But you know, a lot of work gets published with mistakes in them, and a lot of it is not so strong. So and just because it's such a useful experience, we want you to review those articles again. But that's based on the original. Yeah. So you comment on the manuscript of the paper, right? So you recommend whether or not the editor of the journal should publish that paper in the journal. Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay, so you know, that's a lot of details actually, and that's also why we decided to record this. So please review this again when you're working on it. First thing with your group is browse journal articles and shortlist articles that you think are interesting to review, and then decide with your group what an interesting article should be. And please upload that on Canvas no later than Tuesday at 12 o'clock. I'm going to look at it in the afternoon, so please don't be too late. And then we'll on Thursday, we will advise you whether or not to proceed with that article, or maybe with the backup article. So also, you know, maybe list the number 2 article that you are also interested in case the first article does not work. And then also already analyze the introduction. And so I talked about those 4 elements. So please already identify those, and then we can also discuss about sort of how they introduce the research question, so that you can already get some feedback on and some input for writing the first part of the paper. Okay. Yeah, a lot of published articles are downright bad. Yeah. So I already received some questions in the chat, but are there other questions or comments about the assignment? I don't know what that was. Okay. How old can the article be? That's really, I don't mind so much. I would certainly recommend some sort of recent article. So maybe it's nice to have sort of a state of the art right now, right? So right now a lot is being published about social media. So if you hand search, I would start with the most recent editions of a journal. But if you find a good article that's maybe 10 years old or so, it could still work. But I would recommend more recent articles. And indeed, that was a truck too, I guess. I don't know.
Okay. What we could also do for the final part of the paper, for the reviews, maybe we can upload some reviews we've received ourselves on our papers or written ourselves.
Oh, yeah, that's a great idea. That's a great idea. Actually, reviews are often bad as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So every time we publish something or try to publish something, we send it to a journal and we get reviews back. And most of the time our papers are rejected in first instance, and then we have to rewrite them or send them to another journal. So I think that's a good learning experience as well.
Yeah.
So one other thing is that in week 5, there's a work group session devoted to feedback on the on your paper, and basically we give feedback on whatever you send in a couple of days before, or I think that was the Sunday before. So if you and your group decide to only start working on the paper late, perfectly fine with us, but you don't get any feedback from us. So it would be better if you, if before session 5, you will be like kind of done, or at least have a first readable version of the paper. So the more feedback we can give. So please keep that in mind in your planning.
Yeah, and for the feedback, to add for the feedback, I always apply sort of first come first serve basis. So the groups that upload the draft version early, I will start and will also receive the feedback. Sort of the principle.
Okay. Shall we then continue with the lecture? Cool. Okay. Let's get done. So okay. So for the rest of the lecture, we're going to talk about social media at work and enterprise social media. And I have a number of questions for you about social media and social media in work-related settings. Maybe first, nice to, what date is workgroup session 5? Yeah, it's this date plus 4 weeks. I don't know by heart. October 1st or so? Thanks, yeah. And we'll give a schedule about which group gets feedback when. So maybe nice to tell you that yesterday I taught a masterclass called Masterclass Media Psychology for the Greenhouse Group, which is an online advertising agency. So they do search engine optimization, search engine advertising, brand campaigns, digital brand campaigns for a lot of different brands. They're quite huge. In Eindhoven. So it was a masterclass for 10 people. And it turned out that 3 of them actually did business communication, digital media, and were all students of mine. So 3 of them ended up at the company, which is, I think, it's quite interesting, quite nice to see. Sorry. Which I think is was very nice to see that our students end up so well. And it was a masterclass about it's called media psychology, what this is basically about how you can use social media for more business and marketing related purposes, and what the effects of social media are. But it was nice to see so many students of ourselves. Everything is flickering. Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Then it's probably fine. Okay. Then let's continue. So I first want to, so we talked about the group assignment, and I first want to talk about social media. So maybe to start, just type it into the chat. Can you give me some examples of social media? That can be corporate social media or social media you use in your daily life, whatever. Whoa, that's a lot of feedback. Okay, stop. So let's see, what do we have here? So we started with, wow, great, thanks for the feedback. Snapchat, Instagram, Slack, LinkedIn, Trello, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, Instagram, Teams, Microsoft Teams, Yammer, Reddit, Workplace, Canvas, Tinder, which I think is quite interesting, TikTok, YouTube, WhatsApp. Okay, so we have a lot of different social media, ranging from Tinder all to LinkedIn to Reddit. And I'm wondering what exactly characterizes social media. So what is social media? So let's take an example. So let's start with LinkedIn, because that's work related. So some people said LinkedIn. I think Nicholas said LinkedIn. If you or someone else can say, or Indra as well, LinkedIn, can explain to me a bit, why is LinkedIn social media? So what is a characteristic of LinkedIn that makes it social media? I'm going to connecting, networking, connect with others. You can keep up with interesting connections. Keep up with connections. Meet interesting people. Keep up with connections with other people. Everyone can create content. Create content. Okay. And you can create and you can share. Okay, so LinkedIn. So that's one. So let's take another one. Let's take let's take TikTok. Why not TikTok? Sharika said TikTok twice. So someone else? No. Did someone say Snapchat? Yeah, someone else said let's do TikTok and Snapchat. So what do you do with TikTok and Snapchat that makes it social media? Publishing content. Yep, create content, share. Share. Communicate. Like React. Yep, good point. Accessible for people. So, and then there's something that I because someone also said WhatsApp, and someone said let's do WhatsApp. It's used more for entertainment. So does everyone agree or not that WhatsApp is a social medium, or does someone say, "Oh well, I don't really think WhatsApp is a social medium"? even do a never mind. But no, I'm not going to do any polls here. That takes too much time. So, you don't share personal info. It is a social media. I think it's more. Well, oh. So there's kind of there's quite a discussion about. I'm trying to keep up with the chat. So there's quite a discussion about whether WhatsApp is a social medium, and there. Okay. I like a poll. Poll. I had a question. Manage poll. Checked. Hey. Yes. So there seems to be not really a consensus about whether it is social media or not. So and you see from the discussion that it's on one hand it's a communication tool like um, instant messaging and maybe direct communication like a phone conversation or so. But on the other hand, it has some characteristics of social media as well. So I see here you can add stories on Instagram. You do have kind of connections on Instagram and WhatsApp. So you do have sort of a list of connections. So you use it to be social and you connect to people with it. Um, so it's kind of in between. Oh yeah, damn, we are recording this. So it's kind of in between. So and it's kind of interesting. So when I sometimes teach guest lectures or so, no, not really, not yet. I sometimes teach guest lectures for older people, like yesterday. Well, they're not that much older. But when I ask older people, let's say over 30 or so, if WhatsApp is a social medium, they all say no. And they say that things like Wikipedia, which I think you didn't even mention, is a social medium. When I ask younger people, like who are still in high school, they don't even mention, well, they never mention Facebook anymore, of course. They don't mention Wikipedia. They have no, LinkedIn is not relevant. But for them, WhatsApp is a social medium. So it depends on who you are and how you define social media. And as you see here on screen now, there are some characteristics that we'd say, well, yeah, this is social media. So it's some kind of connections, keeping up with connections, creating content, communication, and some other characteristics of social media. But it's difficult. So there are some situations in between. But like you see here, this I think is a useful way to think about social media. So not in terms of we need Yammer in our organization, but think of social media in terms of, okay, what do we want our employees to do? Do we want them to create a profile? Do we want them to connect more to each other? And then search the social media that's appropriate. So I immediately see that the thinking about social media this way, I think, is kind of useful. But also theoretically useful, because this helps us to create a definition of social media. So could someone give a definition of social media? This may be a bit much to ask, but if someone can type, I think social media is a way to, or whatever. Yep. Virtual space where people can meet and interact. I'm gonna write that one down. Make available info to a group of people. Never mind typos. Anything else? Share content and edit each other's content. Share and edit each other's content. And digital medium, digital facilitates networking and content creation. And that's actually pretty interesting, because I think we're quite there with defining social media when you take all this together. So I'm going to get back, switch to the PowerPoint for a moment. Yeah. Oh. So, at least from my perspective, gathered from a bunch of different articles, there is, first of all, there's an explanation for why WhatsApp is kind of in between. Because if you look at all definitions of social media, there's actually two definitions, like a broad and a narrow definition. And the broad definition basically means all mediated interaction, which we see a bit in the first definition, virtual space where people can meet and interact. Is that on the one hand, we tend to consider social media as internet-based or IP-based technologies that allow us to communicate and share information. And that's perfectly fine, and that's a very good definition of social media, but it also includes a lot. So even a phone conversation can be seen as a social medium. On the other hand, you have a narrow definition of social media, and the technical one is internet-based, built upon Web 2.0 technologies, but for us, that's less interesting. But it's about many-to-many interaction based on user-generated content, which is to some extent, I think it's also an important addition, persistent. So if you look at your listed characteristics and definitions, I'm going to go back to the Word now. You see that the creating and sharing content is it may be the most defining thing about social media. It's the extent that you can communicate content and other people can add and edit to it. Think what you can do with Wikipedia, but also even in a online discussion, people can also add and edit the content. They can react and build upon each other's content. And you can imagine that for organizations, that's really, really, really useful, because it allows people to share information, to be creative, to communicate with people from across the organization, and build kind of a repository, an internal wiki based on social media. We'll talk more about that in other lectures as well. So the ability to share, to create and share content and edit and build upon the content is one important aspect. Also, the persistence of social media is also relevant in that respect, because if this would be just a regular offline lecture, we would record it and it would be gone. But now we're going to post this on YouTube and it will be there potentially forever. So suddenly this lecture is persistent, and that allows other people to find it, to also view it, to maybe give comments on YouTube, and other people could use parts of the lecture if this would be a good lecture. But they could, in theory. So that's one. And that's the second one. And the third one is many-to-many. So that means that to a certain extent, back to the definition, so to a certain extent, it's visible, and it's also not necessarily restricted to one or to one-on-one or few-to-few communication. So most social media, even WhatsApp, in which you can have like group conversations, of course, are to some extent many-to-many. And I think that's where the discussion also pointed to for WhatsApp, because WhatsApp is kind of in between. It's on the one hand can be very personal, one-on-one, and on the other hand, it can be many-to-many. But if you look at many social media, it's always to some extent public. So it's always to some extent available for more than one-on-one conversation. Even if you post something on your Instagram, which may be private, it still reaches like a couple of hundred people. So I think we have that as well. So, and the fact that it is many-to-many also encompasses the characteristics that it is about connections. If you cannot make connections on social media, there's no way to communicate stuff to a larger group. So actually, I must say, well done. So that together we came up, I think, with a very good, these four together, I think, actually pretty much are similar, I'd say, to the definition of social media here. So, and then let's talk a bit about the use of social media in organizations. But first, if you don't mind, if it's okay, I'd like to get some water, and then I'll be back. So because we haven't had a break at all, so maybe for you it's also fine to have a break of 5 minutes, no, 2 minutes, and then we'll get back to the lecture. I'll be right back. So, okay, I'm back. I don't know if you can see this, but I recently bought those wireless headphones, and here it's like the Samsung headphones, because it gives some more flexibility. Because I used to have, they're still connected. Used to have the wired ones. We're talking about characteristics of technology. The advantage of the wired ones is that you never forget to take them out, as you do with this one. So now you have to be earpods. Yeah, you have to be more careful that you mute yourself um, when you leave your chair. So if you go to the toilet, or say hi to your girlfriend or whatever, because normally no one can hear it, but now I tried, and these work from like 10 meters away. Yeah, they also have a microphone. The microphone is in the right earbud, and well, you can hear me, so it's actually quite good. So this weekend I checked the quality, so to see if I was still audible, but it works. And the microphone is actually so good that you absolutely definitely have to mute yourself. It's a kind of a interaction between. I think it's a nice example of how technology in unforeseen ways affect the way we work. Because if you have those wired earplugs, if I leave my office, I am away. But now if I leave my office, I can still hear you, and you can still hear me. So you have to be extra aware that there is a distinction between the rooms, and that you mute yourself or take them out. So it's kind of, so handy as these are, that they don't need to be connected anymore, they do disturb work-life balance to a certain extent. So okay, but that's enough about them. But I do think it's a nice example of unintended consequences of technology. So to get back to the lecture, so I already heard a few examples of enterprise social media. So I think we heard Yammer, and whether I forgot what the other ones. So we had Yammer, and did someone say Slack as well, maybe? So if someone can help me out a bit. So you have talk about specific enterprise social media. Yeah, Yammer. Slack is an one that's often used. Yeah, you see that, like, so I think someone, yeah, Teams. So it used to be Skype only, but it gets a lot. It gets a lot more features. Trello, yeah, that you can use it as a social media. And what can you do with these things in organizations? So why do people use social media in organizations? So of course we mentioned a lot of reasons why people use social media, communicating, building a network, etc. But is there anything specific to organizational social media? So like things like Lammer, Check, and Teams? Yeah. Google Docs. So specific uses enterprise social media, sharing info, asking queues. That's one. Yeah. Keeping staff informed. Get to know. A efficient way to reach out. Sharing info and connecting. That's an interesting one. Information management. Could you specify what exactly information management means? Because I'd say that it could also be more difficult to manage information using corporate social media. And in the meantime, I'll keep talking. So the interesting thing is, if you actually look at how organizations use social media, Yeah. So if you look at how people in organizations actually use social media, it's not that different, or to be honest, absolutely no different at all from what you do with social media. So if you think about how you are going to work on this group project, how you do it in other with other courses. So you probably have a WhatsApp group. You have a shared Google Doc in which you work on the paper. Also with Google Docs, you can track changes. People can ask questions. You can discuss. So actually, most of the things you do are exactly the things that people in organizations do with social media, except maybe for the wider knowledge sharing part, that you can actually interact with people from outside of your group, and like you said, reach out and inform the wider organization. Then the internal communication might be better because it's a bit easier. People are always available and everything can also be tracked. Yeah. The difference co-works for friends and family. That's actually an interesting point. So because of course, for an organization, it's pretty much okay if people are always available and everything can also be tracked. But what would a drawback be of being always available? And what would the drawback be of that everything can always be tracked? Yeah, privacy maybe, work-life balance if you're always available, boundaries like work-life, personal life, if you need to respond right away, plan anything, be available, they don't want to be available. Yeah, so you mean to see that touches upon a lot of things we're going to talk about in the upcoming lectures, especially Joost. So it can disturb work-life balance, but also if you need to be available always when you actually do your work. So you're disturbed, can always be disturbed when doing your work. Like when you see me struggling right now with keeping track of the chat and my presentation and the other screen on which the presentation, and I have now with a Word document. So it's difficult. Also, absolutely the privacy issue and always be tracked. Yeah, I'm not going to criticize my boss on social media or be critical of how of my work if everything can be tracked and everything is stored. Everything is persistent. Maybe sometimes you need some private space. And maybe it's also good for an organization if not everything can be tracked. So it can have a lot of positive consequences. So the ability to communicate to a wider audience, to have a repository so that is persistent, but it can also have drawbacks. Also have an other side, and that's interesting I think to think about. So going back to the lecture. So in the one of the papers on the list for today, so you see what people do with social media at work. That's actually many of the things you raised as well. Interesting is that people also used to take a mental break from work, although here they didn't really ask specifically for corporate social media, just social media. But it also helps you to support professional connections, to help you solve issues, to strengthen relationships, to get to know people. So basically, most of the things you mentioned are actually things that people in organizations specifically do with social media. So actually, you get kind of an idea about about what social media is. We've given a definition of social media. We've discussed a bit about how people use it in work. So the final thing is to give you a theoretical idea about characteristics of social media using affordances. Because I think that gives a kind of coherent and clear definition of social media. And I think also those things that are called affordances can be tied to consequences of social media in the workplace. So what's an affordance? Well, we've talked about determinism and constructivism, that on the one hand, you can be deterministic and say, well, this is a characteristic of this technology and this is what effects it will have. On the other hand, you can say, no, it's the other way around. People are free in deciding what they do with the technology. And an affordance is a solution to that issue. So they say, well, it's kind of in the middle, and they define it as perceptions of an object's utility, possibility for enabling and constraining human action. Well, it's still pretty vague, but it basically means that affordances are sort of useful characteristics of a technology. So, and with useful, that means that they are kind of agreed upon characteristics. So if you look at, this is my mouse. So this mouse has a lot of different features. You can define it in terms of color, material, shape. And I can do a lot with this mouse. I can throw it at someone when I'm angry. I can use it as a doorstop. So there are lots of options of using this mouse. Only the thing I use it for is to see where to point my pointer on screen to somewhere. Because that's what we agreed upon and that's what it's made for. So that's the main affordance of a computer mouse. And so, for example, this is someone who uses a tablet to cut vegetables. And cutting vegetables on a tablet is a perfectly fine affordance of a tablet. Only it's not the thing that we are probably going to use it for. Because we've learned and it's designed in such a way and it costs so much money that we're going to use it for different things. Final example, a rock. If you have a rock, you can also define it in terms of shape and consistency, material, elements, whatever. But if you look at the rock and think, the rock is kind of heavy and it has a flat edge, so I can use it to hammer a stick in the ground. And then suddenly your rock is a hammer. And then you see, I can use rocks for that. And then an affordance of a rock becomes hammering stuff into the ground or bashing someone's head in. And that's an affordance. So an affordance is part of the technology, so a thing that you can do with the technology, but also a thing that you have learned that you can do with the technology. So that basically means they're functional, so they enable and constrain actions. You can keep it. So let's not talk about rocks, but talk about social media. So if you look at your LinkedIn, they enable you to keep track of a list of your professional connections. And they constrain you in other things. You cannot use it as a cookbook or something like that. So you can use it for some, they enable some things, they constrain other things. They're relational, so they need to be perceived to become active. So you need to learn that that's how you use the technology. So it depends on the actor, it depends on you and your environment to learn what you can use it for. So it's not always immediately obvious what you can use something for. So it needs to grow in time. And finally, they're contextual. So it's based on the context what you can do with something. And I couldn't find the video, but maybe you can. So there is a video, maybe now you have a couple of videos in which they show a magazine, an old-fashioned paper magazine to a baby of like a year old or maybe even a bit younger. And the baby is swiping the magazine. And the baby is completely surprised that nothing happens. So that the magazine doesn't magically start moving, or it doesn't switch its screen or something like that. I love it. I love this. This is what social media is for. It's wisdom of the crowds. Great. Thank you, Joost. I sounds do that in a book. So it's quite interesting to see, and it's not that weird. I think in 50 years or so, or maybe even a bit less, the people don't even know what a magazine is anymore. So when people, especially when young people see a tablet, they know that it affords them the possibility to swipe and to touch it, so that the screen changes. So that's an affordance, and that's something you learn. And once you have learned that, that becomes an expectation of what you can do with similar media and similar technologies. And that's actually pretty much the same for, well, finding technology designed well, which is affordance already perceivable. When it's obvious what you can do with it, it's designed well. But that's the same with social media. So, and I think the paper by Treem and Leonardi, I think, is very useful for that. So they say, well, if you look at what people in organizations use social media for, you can basically come up with four affordances that are still quite broad, but four affordances of social media that basically are, they are affordances of social media that organizations use and that are useful for organizations. And again, these affordances are learned, but they are also part of the technology. So to discuss them in a nutshell, so next Monday I will go by them once again because they're pretty important. But for now, they define four. So there are other papers that define like six or two or whatever. But I think this is I think still the most useful paper. So they say if you look at corporate social media, there are four main affordances, four main things that you can do with social media. And they say the first one is visibility. And that's what we all already talked about in this lecture, is that it allows you to create content, and that content stays visible. And in organization, that means that if you have a discussion forum or if you use Slack for project management and then say corporate social media to work on projects, that it is visible to your co-workers, and it may even remain visible once the project has ended. So it becomes kind of a knowledge base. So the things that you do remain visible. So your knowledge, the people's behaviors and expertise, and also people's relationships, which of course is very useful in an organization and very useful outside in our ordinary lives as well. Visibility also means reputation and reputation management. It's not only visibility of the things you do in an organization, so the updates you provide, the projects you work on, but it is also that what you see often in social media, and what you see more and more, is that people can that you can manage your reputation. People can give a review of what you did. You are on LinkedIn, you ask recommendations, or people acknowledge you for a certain skill. And that's also part of visibility. It allows others to see what people's expertise is. And finally, of course, notifications. Visibility is also, is someone in the office? It's about being online on WhatsApp, so you know when people can and cannot be contacted. So that's one. And actually, in the other paper by Treem and others, they say that visibility, that is actually the main affordance or the main characteristic of social media, because everything hinges on visibility. And as you will see, the other, I'll explain a bit more about that on Monday, but as you see, the other 3 affordances are also associated with visibility. So the second one is associations. That's also one of the first things you mentioned at the start of this lecture. So social media is being able to develop and maintain and keep up with a network. And all social media also allow this. You have a list of followers and followees on Instagram and Twitter. You have a list of connections on LinkedIn, a list of friends on Facebook, a list of contacts on Snapchat, etc. So the ability to associate people with each other, but also associate knowledge, because, for example, tagging a YouTube video is also a form of associations. You can find all YouTube videos that are tagged social media at work. So the ability to draw associations between people, between content and people is the second main affordance of social media. Third one is also something that you, I think, almost immediately mentioned when you thought about social media. That's editability. And that means you can add to content. So you can create content, that content is then just put somewhere, people can react on that, or people can revise and edit it. So think of Wikipedia, where you can see a history of who said what. But you can also use it yourself. Editability also allows you to build your own profile. So for example, on a dating site, you upload a dating site picture, profile picture. You see how people react to that picture. You try out a few other pictures, and then finally you choose the one that works best. And you do that in your personal life, but you also do that on LinkedIn. So you choose the best photo, you work on your profile, you try to get recommendations, so you can edit your own profile. So that's 3. And also the affordance that allows much of this is persistence. So social media is oftentimes persistent. So it's permanent. You can review it. You can select certain information. And that allows you to grow content and to sustain knowledge over time, which for organizations is very important. And that's the reason why we now have Snapchat. Because, well, we have face-to-face communication, but it used to be that many things, that most of it, what you posted on Facebook, remained visible, and was persistent. And Snapchat actually was the first one to realize that persistence is actually an important characteristic of social media. And they were one of the first ones to realize we can do something with the persistence. We can give control over the persistence back to the publisher of content. Which basically means in ordinary terms that your posts disappear after a certain while, and that you can be selective in the people you choose that see a message. And because Snapchat was so aware of the persistence, and that persistence is something that you can play with, they, I think, they've become a bit less successful because other social media platforms are incorporating that flexible persistence now, with your Instagram stories, etc. But that's, I think, why they became so popular quickly. that's also something for organizations. You know, that's what we talked about a couple of minutes ago, that being visible and being persistent all the time may not always be good for people in organizations, because maybe sometimes you just need, you know, you need some privacy, you need something, you need some information to keep, to remain to yourself or in a select group. But together, these four, visibility, associations, editability, and persistence, I think are a very good way to think about social media and how social media may help or hinder or affect in organizations in general. So finally, I'm aware that's already 1:30. But give me 1 more minute. So if you think about consequences of social media for organizations, so think of how social media can affect communication, can affect knowledge sharing, can affect work-life balance, can affect relationship between colleagues, etc. I think it's very useful to think not about how can Slack help communication, but think about, okay, so you can define Slack in terms of certain types of visibility that you can build into Slack, and in terms of, you know, associations between people, and how do these affect the way that people can share knowledge and communication. Because if you do that, that allows you to go beyond simply saying, we definitely need to install Slack in our organization, but then you can recommend organizations and you to say, for okay, well, Slack may be useful, but I would have incorporated in this and this and this and this way, with these rules and these suggestions, because that would make people more willing to, you know, share knowledge. So I think the relationship between those four affordances and aspects of the organization is a good way to study the effects of social media at work. And from next Monday on, that's exactly what we'll do. So I think that's it for today. So next Monday we'll discuss more about affordances, and we'll talk about theories of computer-mediated communication in organizations and in general. So for now, thank you, and I'll see you Monday. Yeah, we're going to discuss that part as well. So we're going to pick up the lecture from last Monday next Monday. So see you Monday. Thank you very much.